Okay, this morning what I'm going to do is run through some of the bits and pieces I know about making glaze. We use pot glazes purely for convenience. Tend to come in plastic bags in 2.5 kilo, 5 kilo, 10 kilo weights. Now pot glaze reckon that they're so well mixed within the bag that you can actually break the bags down. So a bag of 2.5 kilos can be split into smaller amounts to make samples if you wanted to. 1 kilo makes up with 1 litre of water, and that gives you roughly the right sort of consistency. As well as the glaze ready mix that you need, you'd also need a dust mask, a lawn brush, which is one of these things, okay, and a sieve, which would be, I use a hundreds mesh, which is 100 holes per inch I suppose. That's not the finest, but it's fine enough to take all the small bits out and give you a nice smooth glaze. I'll run through the other bits as we do it, but that's your starting point really, to have some bits and pieces ready together. Have your mask. I'm going to put the extractor on, the air filter on, because the dust from these glazes is really bad for you. It's got all sorts of stuff in it, but I'll show you how to put that into the water without creating too much dust. I also feel if I've got the extractor running, then that's going to suck any small particles through it and away from me. What I'm going to do is top up a marble green glaze, which I've had a look around, that's about half a bucket, so I should easily get a 5 kilo batch of marble green powder into that without any trouble. What I'll need to do is to mix that up, scrape all the bits off, get them all mixed in, and the whole thing will get sieved again. I've also got a clean bucket, which I'm going to put about 3.5 litres of water in to start off with. I tend to put less water in than the complete mix needs, because I use the other part of the mix water to rinse things off and make sure I can get as much of the glaze into the bucket as I can. We've also got the benefit of a machine that's going to vibrate the sieve and makes it much easier to force the glaze through the sieve. Okay, I've finished mixing up the glaze. There's still a bit of slag in the bottom. So this is the half bucket of old marble green. I've had a clean around the edges of the bucket, so I'm just going to tip them in. You have to be careful with these buckets. If they are too full and you try and tip it in something else, you'll find it getting all over your sink because the angle's not enough to make it run in. Now looking in the bottom of this, we've got quite a bit of clag in there, which I'm going to make sure I get off the bottom before I put any clean water into it. So I'm going to put the new glaze in here, make sure it's really well mixed up, there's nothing stuck to the bottom, and then I'm going to pour it through the sieve into the clean bucket and the old part of the glaze. So I've put 3 litres of clean water into the bottom of the old bucket, and I'm going to get something now and just scrape everything off the bottom into that before I add the new glaze powder to it. So while there's a bit more stuff in the bottom of this bucket than I expected, so I'm adding another litre of water to it, which will leave me just one to clean things down later on. I'm just going to mix that up a little bit. It's started to settle in there already. I've put the air filter on full blast, so we're sort of just right next to it here, and any small particles of dust should be sucked in that direction, but I will put a mask on just whilst I tip the powder into it. Alright, so we always tip powder into water, never water into powder. The idea being that the powder settles into the water and floats around less in the air. I'm going to put the edge of the bag into the water a little bit. So I'm lowering that down so the tip of the bag is touching the water and the powder goes straight into it. Okay, and that's settling into it really well. So I need 2 bags. We 2.5 kilos each. And it's just a topping up. The second back going in. Give that a little bit of a steam just to get the powder into it. And just gonna get rid of these bags and let the dust settle a little bit. You can see a little bit of a cloud of dust there, and it is going up towards the air filter, so I'm just going to leave that for a little while. Right, within a few minutes, all the dust that I could see seems to have disappeared and been sucked into the filter. The powder is well below the surface of the water now, so there shouldn't be a risk of dust coming off from it anymore. I'm going to mix a little bit of about half a teaspoon of Epsom salts, which will act as a flocculant and try and stop the glaze from settling really hard when it's left and not used for a bit. I'm going to mix this with a little bit of hot water and then add it to it before I run the whole thing through the sieve into the glaze in the clean bucket and then back through again. So the Epsom salts have been dissolved in hot water, then a little bit of cold water added to it. I'm going to run that in slowly to the new glaze mix whilst I'm stirring it, just to get that really well mixed up with it. Okay, it's quite a thick consistency at the moment, but so when the rest of the water gets added to it later on, it will come nice and smooth over. Okay, so I'm going to pour this through the sieve, turn the vibrator on, socket. Going through really well at the minute. Usually slows down when you get to the thick of it. There is still some stuff left in the bottom of that bucket, which I'm going to have to get in a second. I'm now going to use the lawn brush to stir that through the mesh, through the sieve. So without this thing vibrating the mesh, this would take ages. You can do it, but it just takes a long time. This is much better. Really do with a tiny bit of water added to it, but I'm going to wait, get as much through as I can, because I've only got a litre of water left before I get the mix at the right sort of consistency, and I need to use that to rinse out the bucket with what bits are left in it at the bottom. So that's nearly all gone through. So I've added about half a litre of clean water to the bucket. I'm going to use a lawn brush to get in there, clean the bottom and the sides out. Here, as you can see, it's quite thick on the sides, but a little bit of water makes all the difference. And the glaze is actually going to go back in this bucket anyway. I just want to get as much extra as I can. So tip that into the sieve. Turn it on again. Right, there's virtually nothing left in the sieve. There's one big lump of stuff. That's going down now. Quite often get a few little bits left. If they're too big to go through the sieve, don't put them back in your glaze. You're just going to end up with particle stuff on the outside of your pot. be next to nothing, so don't worry about it. Right, so the final half litre, go in the bucket again, get a long brush, clean it round, clean the stick off. Get as much of the powder back in there so you don't waste anything. Clean the bucket around again. The other thing we don't want is any lumps stuck in here. We should have gone through the sieve. And because you're sieving it through such a fine mesh, it also acts as a mixer. So you don't have to physically get the electric mixer on it. Okay, so that's the last lot. Through there. Brush out any last bits. And it tends to be the heavier elements that stay in there last. Things like the copper. Okay. So that's that. What I'm going to do now is transfer it from that bucket back through again so the whole thing is sieved twice. So the bucket's about 2/3 full, which is about the limit really for trying to pour it straight into it. If it was any fuller than that, what I'd probably do is use a jug and put some in before I could get it a little bit lighter, a little bit more empty so I can get the angle better. But I'm going to go try and tip that in through the sieve, back into its original bucket. It's stirring nice and evenly, so let's have a go. It should go through the sieve really quickly. But it's quite heavy now. You can lift it up a bit higher. It does force it through a little bit. But obviously you don't want it to overflow, otherwise it's not going to do anything. I'm going to use a little tiny bit of water to clean that out again. But I don't know if you can see in the bottom of that the darker pieces. So even with it being freshly made, sieved, stirred, within the time that it takes to pick it up and stick it into the next bucket, some of the heavier particles are starting to fall through the bottom, to the bottom of the bucket, which is why it's so important to make sure you stir your glaze just before you dip a pot, and then between dipping pots, just to get those bits up off the bottom and mixed into the glaze. What you can find is, because you mix the glaze in the old bucket, the old glaze, stuck it in a new bucket, then added the new glaze on top, that when you put it through the second time, the lumps that came from the first mixing in the old glaze start to appear in here. So you're giving it a really good sieve by putting it through the second time. I've added a little tiny bit of water just to loosen those bits there. I've used the brush, I've given the brush a spin to clean it all off, so there's virtually nothing left in the brush now. And then that's going through the sieve just to finish it off. Quick brush around. Spinning there. if we have a look in the sieve, even though everything's gone through, you can see there is a little residue there, but working on the basis that if those bits are too big to get through the sieve, they're going to settle onto your pot and cause sort of rough texture on the outside of the pot, and you're not getting a really smooth glaze. Looking at it, it looks very much like sand, so it's going to be sort of ball clay or something like that, one of the clays that's added to the glaze that's not broken down fully. The particles are a little bit on the big side, so I'm quite happy not to have those in the glaze. So the only thing left to do is to wash everything up, clean it away, but not too bad a job. We've got a nicely topped up bucket of glaze. So that's about it. I mean, that's a dead easy way of doing it. You get in a ready mix glaze from pot glaze, you know the consistency of it, you know roughly how much water you've got to put with it, give or take a little bit. As long as you put in powder, dry powder into water or wet liquid into liquid, then you're minimising the risk of any inhalation of dust, but please use a mask. I wouldn't do this procedure if there was a group in the workshop, although you can do it outside. I mean, today it's absolutely pouring it down, but you could do it outside where obviously you don't need the air filtration going, and the air would normally blow any small particles away from you almost straight away. But I would still use a mask, putting the initial mix into the water. Once it's below the surface of the water, you don't have the same issues at all, and as long as you're washing down wet, then you minimise the amount of dust that gets up into the atmosphere. If you're making your own glazes up from ingredients, slightly different situation. You're using multiple bags of powdered ingredients and you're weighing out into a bucket dry ingredients, generally on top of dry ingredients, until you get the right volume together. If you were sure about what you were doing, you could put each dry ingredient straight into water and not have that hanging around, but you're still opening bags, closing bags, weighing bits in, taking bits off to get the weight right, putting it back in a bag, and your risk of inhalation is a lot more serious there. So a mask definitely there, and I would definitely leave the area to settle if there's no other extraction in the area. If I was doing it here with the one air filter, what I would do is clear the bench next to the air filter, bring my dry ingredients together and work through them with the air filter going full pelt and the mask on. Okay, and obviously then you're washing down with wet, you're clearing any spillage up with wet, and that's getting washed away. Glaze is a massive subject, it gets incredibly complicated, but if you're just using ready-made mixes, you can blend them together, you can do test tiles and mixing one on top of another, you could even take wet and mix them together for a series of experiments there.